Welcome back to Liberty Watch, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Liberty Man Van, where we talk about libertarian principles. We look at the world through a freedom lens. We believe in free markets. We believe in freedom of association. We believe in laissez-faire capitalism. And we believe in the non-aggression principle, which says you can't hit people and you can't take their stuff. What in the world could be controversial about that? You'll see lots of people are opposed to freedom. Lots of people. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a recent Supreme Court ruling which kind of legalized sports gambling. And we're going to look at that in quite a bit of detail. We'll look at the text of the ruling. Justice Alito is the one that he wrote for the majority opinion. It was a 6-3 opinion. And we'll get into that text and we'll kind of digest it and see where his thinking is flawed. The bottom line is they reached the right decision in this decision, but they reached it for the wrong reason. But so that's going to be our lead story. And we'll also spend some time. We're also going to look at the actual Constitution itself, Article 1, Section 8, that authorizes the general government, the Congress, what they can do. So we'll bring that into discussion, and we'll also look at some quotes from the founding fathers, specifically James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And so we'll kind of put that all together and as part of this. And then we'll do a little libertarian humor. And if we have time after that, if we don't run out of time, we'll also cover the recent teacher strikes. And what is recent? Well, today is Monday, is it the 27th or 28th? Anyway, it's Memorial Day 2018. So let's get to it. Our first story of today is called Sports Gambling Legalized. And what it does, it now allows the states to legalize gambling in their state, whereas they were prohibited before due to this law that was passed in 1992. And that law was called PASPA for short. That's an acronym for the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. Now, why do we even care about all this as a libertarian? Why do I care? I care because whenever government steps outside of its bounds and starts doing things that it's not authorized to do under the Constitution, we lose freedom. Because that's something they're doing that we can't do, or they're restricting our freedom some way. So there's a loss of freedom when they step outside their bounds. So that's why we're concerned about it. Now, what is the libertarian perspective then, do you think, on sports gambling? Should people be allowed to gamble on sports? Does it break the non-aggression principle? Are we taking somebody's stuff? Or are we hurting them? And the answer to both of those is no. And I hear some of you saying, well, wait a minute, I can lose my money. That's somebody taking my stuff. But no, not if you've agreed to enter into a bet and the loser of the bet loses money. So you've already agreed to that. So nobody's taking your stuff from you. And there's also the argument that, hey, we can't let people gamble. What if a guy goes and bets the mortgage on a racehorse and loses his house? Well, we believe in maximum freedom. Therefore, people also have to be free to make dumb decisions. Sometimes they do make dumb decisions. And who gets to decide what dumb is, right? So we want the individuals to decide that, not someone else. So so it all boils down to, we libertarians want you to make the decision for yourself, these type of decisions, to take that responsibility on yourself. Okay, now what was the Supreme Court's view? Justice Alito, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote the majority opinion, 6-3 opinion. And let's just go into some of that opinion now. I'm going to read you a little bit of the text. And the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act makes it unlawful for a state or its subdivisions to sponsor, operate, advertise, promote, license, or authorize by law or compact a lottery, sweepstakes, or other betting, gambling, or wagering scheme based on competitive sporting events, and for a person to sponsor, operate, advertise, or promote those same gambling schemes if done pursuant to the law or compact of a governmental entity. All right, so what does all that mean? What this did was, this law, when it was passed in '92, restricted the states from exercising their sovereignty on whether they wanted to have gambling in their states or not. And there was already sports gambling in Las Vegas, so they got grandfathered in. And Atlantic City was grandfathered in, but they didn't have sports gambling already, so the law gave them like a year to implement sports gambling and be grandfathered in if they wanted to. But for some reason they chose not to at that time. Now, oddly enough, it's New Jersey that's bringing this lawsuit against the federal government now, because now they want to have sports gambling. And so they're making the case that this not allowing the states to make their own decision and laws in regards to gambling was a violation of their sovereignty and therefore unconstitutional. All right. Now back to the opinion. Here's Alito again writing. And the Constitution indirectly restricts the states by granting certain legislative powers to Congress. See Article 1, Section 8. And we'll see Article 1, Section 8. We'll go through that here in a little bit so you can see what it actually does authorize Congress to do. And you'll see sports gambling is not on the list. Regulating sports gambling, rather. Okay, back to the opinion here. The Constitution indirectly restricts the states by granting certain legislative powers to Congress while providing in the Supremacy Clause that federal law is the supreme law of the land, ellipsis, which means he leaves part of it out. Supreme law of the land, ellipsis, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Now that's Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, the so-called Supremacy Clause. And we'll discuss that in more detail here in just a minute. He says, continuing, this means that when federal and state law conflict, federal law prevails and state law is preempted. Okay. Now, Alito leaves out a very, very important part of the Supremacy Clause. We're going to read the Supremacy Clause now, and then when we get done, see if you pick up on the important part he left out. The Supremacy Clause actually says, quote, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. That's the end, okay. End of the Supremacy Clause. Now, we just read it. Now, there's a really important part here that he ignores. And it's in the front part of the clause. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof. That's very important verbiage right there. And what that means is it has to be made in compliance with the Constitution, in pursuance thereof. All right? That doesn't mean you can just make anything up and it's going to be the supreme law of the land. It has to follow the Constitution. That's an important phrase there that he left out. It doesn't give the federal government power just to do anything they want to do. The Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, if they're not made in accordance with the Constitution, in other words, if it's unconstitutional, it's not the supreme law of anything. All right. You know, if Congress tomorrow decides that they're going to pass a law, let's go reductio ad absurdum here on this supreme law of the land thing. What if Congress passes a law tomorrow that says you have to burn your firstborn child on an offer to Yahweh? Would that be the supreme law of the land? Obviously not. It's only when laws are made that are pursuant, you know, that in agreement with what they're allowed to do. Well, let's continue. Now, this is Alito again. He says the legislative powers granted to Congress are sizable. No, they're not. They're limited. Totally not correct, Justice Alito. And we'll see Madison in just a minute contradicting him on this topic. And I think Madison was actually at the Constitutional Convention. Anyway, continuing. The legislative powers, says Alito, granted to Congress are sizable, but they are not unlimited. The Constitution confers on Congress not plenary legislative power, but only certain enumerated powers. Therefore, all other legislative powers reserved for the states, as the 10th Amendment confirms. And conspicuously absent from the list of powers given to Congress is the power to issue direct orders to the governments of the states. All right. Now, he's getting around to ruling this is unconstitutional law, but let's look at his reasoning here and some of the phraseology that he uses. First of all, he says powers granted to Congress are sizable. That's not correct. The Constitution confers on Congress. That's not the language that's used in the Constitution. The language that's used is delegate. Delegate and confer, there's a wide difference between those two words. Confer means you give somebody something. When you graduate, they confer a diploma on you. That's yours. They can't take it away from you. That's given to you as a gift. Transferred, okay, to you. It's yours to keep. Delegate is an entirely different word. Delegate implies a boss. Who's the boss? The states, right. It's the states that delegated that power to the central authority. They didn't confer it, Justice Alito. I can't believe we have Supreme Court justices that don't understand the wording of the Constitution. Or they choose to ignore it, I think is more likely. Okay, so he continues. The PASPA provision at issue here, prohibiting state authorization of sports gambling, violates the anti-commandeering rule. It is as if federal officers were installed in state legislative chambers and were armed with the authority to stop legislators from voting on any offending proposals. A more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. And then he says, Congress can regulate sports gambling directly, but if it elects not to do so, each state is free to act on his own. Oh my, there's so much about this that's wrong. This anti-commandeering rule is a rule that says you can't tell this legislature, the state of Hawaii or wherever it is, to do something. You can't command them to do something. So he's saying this is unconstitutional because of the anti-commandeering law. Well, no, you don't have to go to recent law, Justice. All you got to do is look at the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 does not give you the authority to regulate sports gambling. It's not in there. It's not one of the enumerated powers. Period. End of story. But they're not following the Constitution anymore, folks. They're following constitutional law. All right, so let's go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and actually see what it says. It doesn't authorize much of what Congress does now. There's no authority for Social Security, for example, or Medicare. There's nothing in there that allows them to prohibit alcohol and drugs. As a matter of fact, and this just illustrates how far afield that they've gone now following the Constitution. When people wanted to prohibit people from drinking alcohol, that idea gained enough momentum that it was able. Congress knew they couldn't just pass a law making alcohol illegal because it was not one of the enumerated powers in the Constitution. So they knew it wasn't one of the enumerated powers, so what they had to do was pass a constitutional amendment that prohibited alcohol, the sale of alcohol, or however it was worded. So they knew back in 1920 or whenever they did it-ish that that Congress could not pass a law to prohibit alcohol. They had to do it through constitutional amendment. That's a lot harder to do because then you got to have 2/3 of the state also ratify it or agree to it, right? So that's a much higher hurdle than Congress passing a law. And when momentum was gained against prohibition and enough people decided they didn't want to have prohibition anymore, they saw all the damage it was doing, all the crime in the streets, Al Capone everywhere. So when people had had enough of all that, and people dying from tainted alcohol, going blind from tainted alcohol, etc., because it was illegal and the only way they could get it was through the black market. These are unintended consequences of these kind of prohibition laws. But anyway, they finally wised up and said, we're going to lift the prohibition. What did they do? Did they just pass a law? No. They had to go pass another constitutional amendment that repealed. They had to pass the 21st Amendment to repeal the 18th Amendment. Right? Now, Fast forward to the moment when the federal government decided they were going to make all of these drugs illegal, like marijuana. Did they go and get a constitutional amendment? No. All of these prohibition laws are totally unconstitutional. But it doesn't matter, because they do it anyway and nobody cries foul. We got to cry foul on this junk that they do, folks. All right. Now, we're going to look actually at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution here and actually read what the federal government is allowed to do, the central government. What can they legally do by the Constitution? It says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Do you see the ability to provide for people's retirement in there so far? Just think of all the things the federal government does and see if you hear, as I read this here, see if you hear anything about Medicare, Social Security, education, etc. It can have continuing. What this is Article 1, Section 8. Actually, what the central government can do, Congress can do legally: to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Boy, has that regulate commerce been totally taken out of they've twisted that to make it mean that Congress can do anything they want to do. But let's continue. To establish an uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money, etc., etc. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. To establish post offices and post roads. Does that sound like an interstate a highway to you? Interstate highway system to you? To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Congress only shall have the authority to declare war. That's not the president. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Really? To provide and maintain a navy. To make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, etc., etc., to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That necessary and proper clause has been used to justify everything that they want to do now. And the Supreme Court is instead of limiting, the other two branches, they've really just expanded what they can do. Supreme Court hasn't done its job from day one. Unfortunately, one of the John Marshall, one of the very first Supreme Court justices, he had this nationalist concept of how America should be, and he did everything in his power to expand the size and scope of the government. He was a big part of the beginning of the problem back early in, not soon after the dust had settled on signing the document. Anyway, back to Article 1, Section 8, things that are actually authorized for the government to do. But let's do this before I leave this this necessary and proper clause. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, etc., etc., for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. You see, to execute the powers that have been listed here. Not necessary and proper to do whatever you bloody well please, which is the way they've interpreted it, you see. All right. So, that's pretty much the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8 for Congress. Now, let's bring into this debate our old friends, the Founding Fathers. And this is important because these are the people that were actually at the Constitutional Convention. They were there. They heard the debates. They were involved in the debates. Justice Alito wasn't there. Here we go. Here's James Madison, Federalist 45. Now, as you'll recall, the Federalist Papers were these documents that were written and distributed like it was in New York and went to the New York newspapers. It didn't really have much of an effect nationwide. So, scholars often give them more credit than they deserve. But they're important because they were used to justify what the Federalist Papers were trying. They were kind of a sales pitch for the new Constitution. Hey, this is why you support the new Constitution. And it was John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison that wrote them. James Madison from Federalist 45. Here's part of his sell pitch as to why we should ratify this. You states out there, see, this was going to the states now to be ratified or not ratified. And he says, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." No, Justice Alito, they're not sizable. Beg to differ with you there, bro. Okay. And also, James Madison, speaking in Federalist number 39, he says, quote, "The local or municipal authorities form distinct and independent portions of supremacy, no more subject in their respective spheres to the general authority," and by general authority he means the federal government, "no more subject in their respective spheres to the general authority than the general authority is subject to them within their own sphere. In this relation, then, the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one because its jurisdiction pertains to enumerated objects only and leaves to the states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects." In other words, only those enumerated powers, things we've listed in the Constitution, those are the only things you guys can do. Its jurisdiction pertains to enumerated objects only. You can't make stuff up out of thin air and say that you can do it. And leaves to the states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. And this is, that's basically the idea behind the 10th Amendment. Okay. Now, from Federalist 83, we're going to hear from Alexander Hamilton. Quote, "An affirmative grant of special powers would be absurd as well as useless if a general authority was intended." End quote. An affirmative grant of special powers. In other words, special powers, he's referring to those items that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 that the Congress can do, that the new government can do. All right? And so they've listed them. He says, basically, why would you list them if you were given the general authority the ability to do anything? It wouldn't make sense to list what you can do if it can do anything, right? He says it would be absurd as well as useless if a general authority was intended. In other words, the general authority to do anything wasn't intended. Justice Alito. All right, now back to Madison again, and this time he's on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1792. And then they're discussing the Commerce Clause, or some general authority clause in the Constitution. And he says, quote, "I venture to declare it is my opinion that were the power of Congress to be established in the latitude contended for, it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America." Here's Madison warning us. Now listen, this is great, because as I read through this, you're going to say, wow. Just listen and see if any of these things sound familiar to you. Madison continues, quote, "If Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take care of religion into their own hands. They may appoint teachers in every state, county, and parish. They may pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. They may assume provision for the poor. They may undertake the regulation of all roads other than post roads. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. For every object I have mentioned would admit the obvious application of money that might be called provisions for the general welfare." End quote. So he smashes this general welfare as being anything other than just describing how you can put into action powers we've already listed for you. And he's saying general welfare doesn't mean you can do anything you want to do, basically. And, that's the long version of it here. So, this was Madison looking forward and giving us a warning. And so, in other words, the general welfare, necessary and proper, and commerce clauses were not powers of their own, but descriptions of the purposes of those limited and enumerated powers already mentioned in the Constitution. So those clauses in the Constitution have been misinterpreted to give the federal government wide powers that were never intended. Here's the guys, Hamilton and Madison, that were actually at the Constitutional Convention. Justice Alito, I trust them, and I don't trust you. And now for a little libertarian humor. And here's the graphic and the caption, and it shows some folks crawling under a fence. And the caption reads, "Look at me crawling under barbed wire to escape free market capitalism." And at the bottom it says, "Said no one ever." And this is true. I mean, how many people do you see fleeing capitalist countries to try to get into North Korea or Cuba, running from the U.S. to try to get into Cuba or to Venezuela now, or any of these socialist or communist nightmares? It doesn't happen. It always works in the other way. I wonder why that is. Well, it's because people are happier under capitalism than communism or socialism. And the wall there kind of reminds one of the wall that separated East Berlin from West Berlin during the Cold War. And those of you that aren't old enough to remember the Cold War and the period when the Soviet Union existed, East Germany was one of their satellite states. And right there in Berlin, you had half of the city divided, half in communist East Berlin and half, in capitalist West Berlin. And people died there all the time trying to cross that wall to get into West Berlin. It never went the other way. It never went in the other direction. Not once. Not once in the whole time the wall was there for decades. But people were willing to risk death to escape tyranny and to get into freedom. And speaking of the Berlin Wall, that took me down this memory hole.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And that's the show for today. Thanks for joining us. We're glad you came. If you enjoyed it, tell a friend. We'd like to grow the show. You can find me online at libertymanvan.com. That's where my blog is. And you can click on links in the blog to get to my videos. Or you can just go straight to Liberty Man Van on my YouTube channel, Liberty Man Van on YouTube. That's 3 words. And you can go support me at patreon.com/LibertyManVan. Thanks again for joining us, and be sure to be here next time on Liberty Watch, where we don't believe you need some guy with a bullhorn to tell you what to do.